La la la! We are moving to the third chapter of this book on palm trees at the North Pole. You are asking me now, you keep telling these stories about the past climates and the dinosaurs and the meteorite strike and the ice ages and the bottom of the Bering Strait and so on. And then you mention climate change this way and that way, and winter was warmer and milder and so on and so forth, colder. How do you know these things? What exactly are you using to talk about the past? Well, my good friends, the geoscientists, paleoclimatologists, and so on, are spending a lot of time under the ocean, on Antarctica, on Greenland, and elsewhere, collecting evidences of the past climates, and they are in air bubbles and tree rings and corals and speleothems in the caves. You have those stalactites and stalagmites and so on. All of them have some evidence of past climates. So here we will read why you already know more than an 18th century geologist. At that time they didn't have so much knowledge as you just collected at your young age. Why there are scratches on the mountains. How a scientist gets over a broken heart about not finding what he wants or she wants or finding something not so fun. How the earth breathes in and out. How to make a hockey stick out of tree rings, what ancient air bubbles can tell us, and how fingerprints give the culprit away. So in short, we'll learn about research into climate change from the past. When we say fingerprints, you probably already are thinking of detectives. Maybe you're not old enough, but when something happens, a crime has occurred, somebody has stolen something, or worse, then the police come around and they dust things and they see if there are any fingerprints, and they carefully collect all that evidence. So if fingerprints can be matched to a particular person, if the person's fingerprint is in the file on the computer, and so on and so forth. So here we are looking at the various illustrations of how geologic layers look different slopes, and you find bones, and you find old ships, and you find half-eaten fruits and pollens and other things. And you talk about 6,000 years ago, where James Ussher, who lived from 1581 to 1656, was an archbishop. People did things. They recorded what they saw, maybe sunspots, maybe high tides, low tides, wind changes, and so on and so forth, right? So time for some research now. You are young, but here we are going into research. 200 years ago, people did not know more or less everything that you have already read so far or listened to me until the 18th century. European scientists didn't do much research into the earth and its climate, past climate. They believed that the entire story of our planet was already in the Bible. So there wasn't that much more left to research, but this is only true for the Western world and Europe at that time mostly. But other places, Arabs and Asians, had done different things. God had created the earth according to the Bible around 6,000 years ago. The Irish Archbishop James Ussher had worked it all out for himself on Saturday, October 22nd, in the year 4004 before Christ. At 6 o'clock in the evening, God created heaven and earth. Why do we have to go to 4004 if earth is 6,000 years old and we are in 15 whatever that he was at? Then you want to go back that far. He had looked at the Bible stories and compared them with the historical events such as a lunar eclipse and the death of a famous king, as he could find in historic records. And everything must have begun in October, of course, because otherwise there would have been no apples for Eve to take a bite out of. So this apple, which I refer to as things we find in the past, is not found, but it's a story, a mythology, a text that talks about Adam and Eve, the temptation, and so on, and the apple is of course a key part of that. After a while, the great flood happened. You know the story of Noah and OAH in the ark with all kinds of animals because God had flooded the world. This, of course, explained all those bones and fossils in the ground. They must belong to the animals that Noah has been unable to save. So suddenly a flood came and all these animals looked up to Noah and said, Noah, save us. He built this great big ark and they could all survive under it, and of course he couldn't save everybody. But in the 18th century, miners went digging deeper and deeper into the earth in search of coal to fire steam engines. Geologists saw that the earth had consisted of layers, as we see here, each with its own sort of stone and with different kinds of fossils. However, these layers were not always near and straight. There were some ups and downs and changes in thicknesses and the composition of what they contained, and they were at an angle and so on and so forth, right? So if we go back to 6 billion or 600 lots of numbers here, 6,000 million years, no, that cannot be, 60 million years, sorry, I'm being a little thick here, sorry about that. James Hutton, during 1726 to 1797, who was a geologist, used these layers that could only mean that there had been other disasters like the Great Flood well before 6,000 years, but now the earth was finished with this flood business, or so they thought. The Scottish scientist James Hutton had a very different opinion about all of this. Those layers had developed one by one. They were pushed together, crumpling and wearing down. The same forces made the mountains appear and disappear in the past, and still they do today. Lots and lots of time was required for this to happen because things move slowly. Sometimes we say glacial pace. Remember, we said glaciers build up on 100,000 years ago and melt away on 100,000 years ago. Sometimes we say geologic pace, which means they move at the pace of millions of years, up or down. Far more than 6,000 years ago, Archbishop Usher had calculated that the world was formed, heaven and earth were formed, and so on. Scientists like Hutton found it very difficult to sell their ideas to other people. They were living in a religious age, and most scholars assumed that the Bible was completely correct. But gradually more scientists came along with new theories that indicated the world was very old indeed. There was Charles Darwin, for instance, who discovered that animals and plants developed very slowly from other species. Many millions of years were needed for that to happen. Many millions of years. We already talked about old earth, and we talked about hundreds of millions of years old, and we said photosynthesis and the trilobites going back to 3.5 billion years or 3,500 million years, right? More and more people began to think that the earth was maybe older and that the Bible was not telling the whole story. They became curious about how exactly the world worked. Who did those grand bones, giant bones in the ground, belong to? How far away are the stars, and where did those strange stones come from? Right? So we'll come back and start looking at these wandering stones. You look at a rock and you think it must have been there for a long time, well before you were born or your grandparents were born, and so on and so forth, and yet you may be looking at a rock that was not there before and was somehow carried there by glaciers or water. Maybe it popped out of the ground because the earth moved up and down, and so on and so forth. So geology and biology and chemistry and so on are combined to put together the detective work for science of the past, climate history of the past, earth history of the past, to say, well, Bible had a nice story of Noah's flood and God flooding and creating heaven and earth, but maybe the details are a bit older. So you have to be always careful about hurting people's religious sentiments. So when you ask questions or tell people what you know. Always be careful, okay? You don't want to upset people. You want to be sure of your science and learn and then find ways to tell the story yourself more accurately than the Bible seems to have done. That's the learning part, okay? You may grow up and become a teacher like I did, and maybe you get to talk like this to people and say what the books are saying and what science is saying and so on and so forth. Okay? See you in the next podcast on a wandering stone, and we'll see why it was wandering around and what it tells us about past climate. Okay?